I have 7 slides, so I'm going to go less. But, and maybe even not quite 20 minutes, but we'll see what we can do. So basically, I'm going to talk about the signs and symptoms of concussions, and they tend to come in 4 categories. And they also kind of come, there's a first wave of concussion symptoms, and then a second or even a third wave. The first wave tends to be the physical symptoms, and they tend to be more related to the actual insult of the brain. Mike showed you the wonderful picture of the baseball bat. If the baseball bat moves quickly enough, and you don't move your head quickly enough, then you get some of these physical symptoms. So depending on what the injury is, you might have nausea or vomiting, especially early on. Almost always you'll see headache, and headache is one of the symptoms that typically is there at the beginning, but also tends to be present much longer than some of these other ones that tend to resolve. So there's sensitivity to light or sound. Sometimes vision can be affected. Some of the kids that we see, well, we mostly work with kids. Some of the kids that we see will have reading problems, for instance, that is related to the concussion. Balance is actually one of the most sensitive issues, especially early on, but even that can persist quite some time later. And feeling tired or having no energy, it's you know, some of the kids that we see, you know, you'll hear stories about. I went with my parents to pick out a video, and I was sitting in the car outside the video store, and thought, oh well, you just went and picked something. I don't have the energy. One of my best friends pulls up in the car next to ours, and I didn't even have the energy to roll down the window and yell, hey, you know, what's going on? So the fatigue is an enormous issue initially, and it's an issue that can really last quite a bit longer and can have a huge impact and can cut really across quite a number of areas of functioning. The cognitive symptoms. Not surprisingly, after getting smacked by a bat, you might have difficulty thinking clearly, but even beyond that, often the first things that come to mind during a concussion are those physical symptoms, but after that, one of the most common things that you hear kids saying is, I feel like I'm in a fog, or I feel like there's a curtain between me and my friends or my parents or my teacher. And that fogginess is something that is that's often, I think, one of the slowest things to recover. And initially you tend to recover, especially as the physical symptoms disappear. The recovery looks as if it's happening very quickly, but then some of these cognitive symptoms, especially the fog or difficulty concentrating, especially in a room where there are other things going on. Right now, thankfully, you can just listen, but if you had to listen, decide what to take notes on, and write, and while you're writing, still listen to what's going on, that can be quite challenging for students, high school students, university students. Difficulty remembering new information. Because of the impact on the brain, new learning can be incredibly difficult. Accessing old learning can be incredibly difficult. And the ability to connect that new learning to what you've learned before as a way of really making it your own information and making it kind of stick with you, that can be an enormous difficulty for a lot of the kids that we see. A lot of the kids that we see, again, most of the ones that we see, I should mention as well, have been symptomatic for quite a period of time. think in the adult literature at least, 7 to 10 days is about the length of the typical concussion. About 85% of adults who have a concussion should recover either absolutely or almost absolutely within that week to week and a half. I don't think there is good data actually with kids, but I'm sure it's less than that 85%, and I'm sure it's more than the week to week and a half. But some of the things that you notice, and this is particularly with smaller kids as well, who don't have the words to say, well, I don't feel like I'm myself, or I feel like there's a fog. I'm not quite sure how to say what it is that I'm feeling. They might just be irritable, and they might be fussy and cranky. Mind you, teenagers can also be fussy and cranky too. We see that the odd time. There's a couple of, kids will sometimes, or parents more particularly, will say, it's almost like my daughter disappeared, or it's almost like my son disappeared. There's been a personality change. They went from being easygoing to being very irritable, very snappy, or they went from being very happy and interactive and social to being very, very withdrawn and almost seeming depressed. And that is, depression is I think it's almost a cause and a symptom. In concussion, often people will think, well, of course, so-and-so is depressed because they've just lost their sport. They've just lost 5 days a week of practice. They've lost their peer group. But if you look at actual brain functioning, I think depression is actually a part of that concussion or post-concussion syndrome as well. So it certainly is tied into some of the losses, the social losses that happen, and the exercise losses that happen. But I think it's also a key component of it, of post-concussion syndrome itself. One of the kids that I just saw today, his parents were absolutely amazed that this little guy, a 9-year-old, who was always very, very even-keeled, is now very emotional. He realized on the weekend when he was out playing with his younger brother and his older brother that he couldn't do a lot of the things that he used to be able to do. And he became tearful about this. And the parents were thinking, what is going on? Like, our little guy who never cried ever in his life, now all of a sudden is becoming emotional and tearful. And that, again, I think is part and parcel of that insult to the brain and the recovery from it. Sleeping. Kids with concussions tend to have disordered sleep. They often will have difficulty falling asleep. If they do fall asleep easily, if they're up, if they roll over, they might not be able to get back to sleep. Sometimes you might have kids who go from, say the typical 6, 7 hours, 8 hours of sleep to 14 hours isn't enough. They could always use more and more and more sleep. Or they might have less sleep. It's quite variable. Neuropsychology. What does neuropsychology have to do with concussion? A neuropsych assessment tends to be a fairly comprehensive assessment. Most of the kids that we see, we like to have about 6 or 7 hours of face-to-face testing, and we tend to look rather broadly at what a child or an adolescent can do. The reason for this is kind of clinical, in addition to looking at just the concussive symptoms. If we wanted to just say, yes, Jason or Jennifer is still suffering from a concussion, we could look specifically at areas that we think would show difficulties. And those would be things like working memory or reaction time, how quickly you process information. As you see, what we look at in terms of neuropsych is quite a bit broader than that. We look at general levels of cognitive functioning or intelligence, like attention, memory, language, visual, spatial, motor sensory, mood and personality, and particularly executive functioning. And the reason that we do kind of a broad-based assessment is really for clinical purposes. It's one thing to say, nope, you are not, technically you're not suffering from the after effects of a concussion anymore, or yes, you are suffering from a concussion. With the pattern of strengths and challenges that you see in the test results, you can actually link them to recommendations. So based on not just the difficulties that you're having, but based on also on the strengths that you're showing in the testing, we can make recommendations for how best to have this person function well or better or best in school or at home. How should we structure homework sessions? How should we structure testing situations? And I think the key to a good neuropsychological assessment is really that breadth and that depth, and that lets you be, I think, more clinically helpful, which at the end of the day, everybody wants to know, yes, is my son or is my daughter still suffering from the effects of a concussion? But even more so, what do we do? Where do we go? What sorts of things should we be thinking about, and should we be trying to put in place here? And finally, this will segue to Annalise, but again, the key to a good assessment is increasing understanding of that individual. And with proper understanding, then you can actually link back to home, school, playground, wherever, in order to assist in and promote recovery.
Yeah. Okay, so again, just to remind you, if you do have questions, to write them down, keep them in your head, and then we'll have